Let's look at number 2. The reasoning is most vulnerable to criticism. Why? So what's the flaw? What's wrong with this argument? So it says that this council member Smith has proposed a new ordinance that would prohibit the use of bait and switch sales tactic. But Smith must have amnesia because 4 years ago, he owned a store that was famous for doing just that. Clearly, therefore, here's the main point of the argument, his proposed ordinance doesn't even merit being considered, right? We should totally dismiss his proposal. Why? Because he himself did the thing that he's saying should not be allowed. Now, this argument doesn't make any sense. Just because he used to do the thing that he's arguing should be prohibited doesn't mean it shouldn't be prohibited, right? Just because support doesn't mean conclusion, right? If I propose that murder should be illegal, and then you come and say, well, yeah, but you murdered someone 10 years ago, so therefore murder shouldn't be illegal? That doesn't make any sense. Yeah, this guy did this thing 4 years ago, and now he's coming along and saying, yeah, I did it 4 years ago, but I'm arguing that it should be illegal, right? What does the fact that he did it 4 years ago have anything to do with whether or not it should be illegal? So just because support doesn't mean conclusion. Let's look for something in the answer choices that expresses that. A says that the argument is flawed because it dismisses this ordinance based on the source rather than because of the content. So let's see, does it do that? What's the source of the ordinance? The source is this person, Council Member Smith. And essentially, we are dismissing the ordinance. Smith is proposing that we should do something, and we are dismissing that proposal because of information about the source, about this person, that this person once broke this rule that they're proposing should now be enacted. So A is exactly describing what this argument is doing, and it's exactly describing the flaw, which means it's the right answer, right? We're dismissing this proposed ordinance. We're saying, no, we shouldn't make this a rule. You know why? Because the person proposing that we should make it a rule once did this thing, right? So we're giving some information about this person's personal history that therefore, according to this argument, means that we should totally dismiss the rule just because they're the ones proposing it. And they once broke this rule. So we're using information about this person's personal history to say, therefore, let's just dismiss this rule. That doesn't speak to whether it's a good idea to have the rule or not. So therefore, this doesn't make any sense, right? If it's a good rule, we should have it. If it's a bad rule, we shouldn't have it. So whether this person did something 4 years ago should have nothing to do with whether we should dismiss the proposal or not, and therefore A is correct. B says that the argument is flawed because it takes a single fact that's not compatible with a claim as enough to show that therefore that claim is false. Now, this doesn't seem to fit our argument because what in the argument is a claim that we're trying to say is false, right? The conclusion isn't saying that a claim is false. The conclusion is saying that Smith's proposal should not be considered, that we should dismiss it. But we're not trying to say that it's false. We're not trying to say that he's lying, that he's not actually proposing this thing, and he says he's proposing it, but that's a false claim, right? We're not saying that it's a false claim. We're saying that, yeah, he's proposing this thing and we shouldn't listen to him, right? So we're not trying to show that a claim is false and there's no single fact that contradicts with a claim. And we're saying, well, since there's a single fact that contradicts with a claim, therefore that claim must be false, right? There's no contradiction here between a fact and a claim. So B doesn't really seem to match. C says that the argument's flawed because it doesn't make a needed distinction. It doesn't distinguish between deceptive sales tactics, which is what the argument is about, whether that should be prohibited or not. Deceptive sales tactics, bait and switch. It doesn't distinguish between that and legitimate methods of increasing sales. Well, the argument isn't about legitimate methods of increasing sales, right? The argument is about deceptive sales tactics like bait and switch, whether this bait and switch deceptive sales tactics should be prohibited or not. Should this deceptive sales tactic be prohibited or should this deceptive sales tactic not be prohibited? And we're very clear in defining this bait and switch sales tactic. We're not talking about legitimate methods of increasing sales. That's not what this argument's about. So C doesn't really make any sense. Why would we have to distinguish between these two things? We are very clear that we are talking about this one thing, bait and switch deceptive sales tactic. And therefore, C doesn't really seem to fit this argument. It's not like we're mixing that up with legitimate methods of increasing sales. D says that the argument makes a conclusion that just restates a claim presented as support for that conclusion. Well, the conclusion of the argument is that Smith's proposed ordinance doesn't merit consideration That's not restating something that was brought as support for that, because what was the support brought for that conclusion? The support that was brought for that conclusion was that 4 years ago, he did the bait and switch thing. And the conclusion is, therefore, we should reject his proposal. Those two statements aren't restatements of each other. They're saying different things. One is a statement about the history of the life of Smith and what he did 4 years ago, and one is about whether we should reject his current proposal today, right? So D does not seem to match this argument at all. E says that the argument is flawed because it overgeneralizes. It generalizes from a limited number of instances of something to all instances of that type. So that doesn't really seem to match, because the conclusion is not a generalization of any kind. The conclusion is about Smith's specific proposal. It's saying that Smith's proposed ordinance, this one thing that he's proposing, should not be considered. We're not generalizing and saying, and therefore no council members' proposals should be considered at all, ever, right? We're not generalizing. We're just making a conclusion about one case, and therefore there's no generalization going on. There's certainly no overgeneralization going on, so E does not seem to match. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.